Welcome to session 2. We're working through a little acronym called C.A.S.H. C-A-S-H. Previously I've talked about the C word, communicate. And we're talking about 4 principles using the acronym C.A.S.H. in order to help you create a culture for giving in your church. So much of long-term, successful, sustained giving is about creating a culture in your church for giving as a pastor. We've said a lot about communicate, so we'll move on to the second word, the A word. The A word is the word ask. Yes, ask. And here's what I want to say about ask. You can't be afraid to ask. Now, you need purpose behind your asking, and we've shared that in the previous session on communicate. But you can't be afraid to ask. And I want to share with you a few things about the ask that I think is very important. First of all, when you're getting ready to ask, you have to understand that timing is very, very important. By that I mean you need to read the morale in your church before you attempt to put a stewardship campaign in place, or before you attempt to put on a special missions push, or before you attempt to raise money for a special building project or project in your community. You need to read the timing and the morale in your church before you ever launch into that, because it is possible to stretch people too far. By that I mean, as a pastor, I have several people who work with me. I have a youth pastor and a children's pastor and a music pastor. And if they're all trying to raise money for projects or trips or a ladies ministry at the same time is doing something out in the lobby of the church, and I'm trying to get up and raise money for a stewardship campaign because we're looking at relocating our church, that's far too many things going on at one time. So you have to know what's going on with your planning calendars. You have to know what's going on in your church. You have to take authority over all of the other fundraisers and perhaps say, we're going to strategically take our planning calendar and lay out our giving so that we're not stumbling over the top of one another and in essence hindering our ability to raise money. So timing is everything when it comes to this issue of planning and strategically placing your ask at the right time of the year. The second thing I would say about being strategic is this issue of morale. If your church is down or your community has went through an economic downturn and the local industry has moved out of town, and recently, in the last 4 or 5 years, we know there's been some economic turnover and companies have moved and there's been problems in cities. You don't want to go with a big, strong ask in an environment where people are hurting and just trying to figure out how they're going to make their next payment for their house. You have to be sensitive and ask God to give you insight and wisdom as to how you're going to even approach that. And it may be the Lord has given you the right vision, given you the right project, but if you have that timing wrong, you're going to hurt yourself. Timing is everything when you're getting ready to ask. So read your community. Read the environment in your church. Read the morale in your church. Read the economic situation that your people are working through before you put your ask together. And I would suggest you do a little testing, you do a little inquiring, you approach those things with open-mindedness, and if things are right and the morale is right and you've prepared for the ask, then don't be afraid to go there and give what we call the big ask. Now that's something else I would want to say to you. You need to learn to prepare before you ask. Because when you ask, you're going to open people up for questions. And you need to be prepared to answer those questions before the ask ever comes. Let me give you an example of that. A biblical example of that is in Nehemiah chapter 2. We know in chapter 1, Nehemiah is burdened and his heart is so heavy because he's received, or the king he's working with as the cupbearer, he's the cupbearer for the king, Xerxes. The report comes in that Jerusalem is in ruins. The foundations of the city have been destroyed. They're crumbling. The walls are crumbling. Jerusalem is in bad shape, God's holy city. And the Bible says in chapter 1, verse 5, that when Nehemiah heard this report, he sat down and he wept, and he prayed, and he fasted, and he began to seek the Lord as to when God would want him to, what God would even have him to do. So he began to pray, and throughout chapter 1, as he prayed, we begin to see that God enhanced this vision. He began to give him clarity on what he should do. The problem was the vision was big, and he didn't know how he was going to get the resources. When you get to chapter 2, after he had been praying, prayer is such a key part of your ask. After he'd been praying, he's in serving the king and bringing him the wine like he did and fulfilling his daily duties. And the king asked him, Nehemiah, what is wrong? For the Bible says that his countenance had changed. And his countenance was sad. Well, Nehemiah was prepared for the ask. It's lovely to see the way Nehemiah answers the king's question. The king brought one question after another, and it's very clear that Nehemiah was strategically prepared for the king's questions. Listen, you don't ever get up in front of your people with a big ask without being strategically prepared and without thinking through every possible question they could have for you. One thing that they may have for you is one simple question would be, how are we going to pay for this? You need to be prepared to ask, or answer, I should say. We're going to raise X amount of dollars. We've got X amount of dollars already set aside, and I need to ask you for this amount of dollars. And if we do these things, we can accomplish this vision that God has put in our heart. You have to learn to ask. So let's review just a moment. Be sensitive to the timing. Is the morale right in the church to even place such a big ask on them? Is the economy correct? Read the signs around you. Is it a good time to tackle a project like this? Are you being realistic in your ability to even be able to afford it, let alone raise the amount of money you're going to need? Timing is everything. And then don't be insecure with the ask. If God's released you and you've answered those questions, then step forward and do it. Prepare for that ask. Do what you can do to have your plans laid out. Know how you want to do it. Know what you're going to do. Know how much it's going to cost. Know how you're going to raise the money. Do all of your homework prior to asking. The last thing I would say, don't ever surprise your key leaders with an ask that they're not prepared for. Get with them early. Bounce some things off them. Consult with them. Talk with them. And if you don't have people in your church that will have insight into the arena that you want to, like if you're raising money to build a building and you have no one that knows anything about building in your church, then figure out how to get to know a builder in the community so that you can go with some expertise when you step forward for the ask. That expert will give information to you that most likely will be free, and you can share and answer questions based on the ask and the questions that come to you. So let's not forget the A word. We've talked about communicate, the C word, communicate. But as we look at the acronym C.A.S.H, A is an important word. If you don't ask, you'll never raise the money.